Good morning. Welcome back again. Here we are. We are doing our next installment of these webinars. The topics are coming up, and today's topic is going to be regarding. Actually, before that, sorry, I got to get down and introduce. Same co-parts are with me today. Joel Terensky and Jason Wines are both with me here to answer questions. Look at them, just on cue right there. They will be answering your questions. And again, I promise I will get to the point where we're responding to the questions that don't get asked, but I think they're doing a pretty good job about answering all the questions about the topic that we're talking about for that day. Again, we appreciate your time. I know a lot of you, everyone's doing webcasts now, so choosing to view this one, I appreciate it. They're slowly getting those videos, I swear, up to the YouTube page. There should be 2 more up there by the end of business today. So there should be a total of 4 on that YouTube channel, and a pretty good playlist. So you should be able to see that. And there's others for Pandora as well, so you can watch those. But today we're talking about routers. So let me get in here. Spyder, since pretty much its inception, and by necessity, has controlled external routers. Okay, this is dating back to the 2 and 300 series. Actually, I didn't even think to bring up those, even though they're end of life. 2 and 300 series, if you remember, let's see if I can pull something up here real quick while I'm talking. When it started in the 2 and 300 series, every input was directly associated with a layer. Okay, so input 1 was layer 1, input 2 was layer 2. So if you direct patched a source to an input, we call that direct to layer. So the idea is that if you patch, say, a camera into input 3, it would only be able to be viewed on layer 3. Okay, direct to layer. As I dig for a picture here, I'll leave that alone. Anyway, so hence the need to be able to control upstream routers. And some of these 2 and 300 series systems only had 3 or 4 inputs, maybe 6, or depending on the chassis that you purchased. So you only had 5, 6, 8, maybe 8 layers to work with. A lot of times people have say you have a super wide screen that you're going to be generating native content for, which is going to require multiple channels. You have a primary system that has maybe 3 channels that's all overlapped and data doubled and all that as well. But then you have a backup system, right, that has another 3 channels. Well, that plus whatever keynote and backup and whatever other sources that you're bringing in the system, maybe you run out of physical inputs to patch them into. So utilizing a matrix router, a video matrix router, to warehouse all of those sources into there, patch all those sources into the inputs of that matrix, then take the outputs from that router and feed them into the Spyder's inputs. Now I have a crude drawing here that I'll show you real quick. I'm going to pop out of this PowerPoint here for a second and share a picture. It really, it's something that it's a visual I used for parallel configurations, which is another topic for another webinar. But let me just pop this on here. If you look at this, this is another crude kind of drawing, but imagine only one Spyder, okay, and only 1 pixel space. But everything from this Spyder right here, you'll see a bunch of sources coming in, right, into a common matrix. Obviously, different formats would require different routers, but say they were all the same common connector type. We would warehouse all those sources coming into that router along here. Then we would take outputs from that router and feed them into the Spyder inputs down here. Now, Spyder is communicating with that router via RS-232 or Ethernet, depending on the protocol. We have a list of protocols that I'll make sure that I present at this time, hopefully right there or there. When the recording comes out, I'll make sure I put a list in. And then at that point, when you bring in your sources, instead of saying this source resides on input 1 HDMI, you're saying this source resides on my say my Lightware router on input 27, and then Spyder knows that it's on input 27. So if I need that to go to the pixel space and load it to the screen, it would send a command to the router, send that cross point, make that cross point switch to a physical input on the Spyder, and then I have it available to put on any layer in the system. So I only need it to come in once into the Spyder, okay? Once it hits an input, then I can then route it to any of my layers, depending on how many layers how many layers I have in my system, okay? So this isn't an inaccurate drawing, it's just a little more complex drawing, but maybe I'll see if I can tidy that up for the recording. Now, let me go back to my PowerPoint here. Okay, so how do you add a router? Okay, lots of ways to do that. I'm going to pop through some of these slides intermittently because there's a couple of ways to do this in pure Spyder fashion. You can add routers a couple of ways. So I'm going to toggle back to, oh my goodness, look at all the stuff I have open, to our config. Okay, so during the new configuration process, this would be webinar 102 when we talked about configuring your Spyder. If you were to go to File, New, and start with a new and empty configuration, let's not do a new and empty one. Let's go back and do current. And I'll go next, and it brings up the pixel spaces that we have. It brings up all the outputs that we have. And I get to this last menu here where we can carry over data, but there's an option here to add routers. So if I click right here and say add a new router, whoops, it brings in a line there to go ahead and configure this. So I would select it, give it a name. So you're describing this router, right? So I'm going to call this HDMI router. Okay. And under where it says virtual, we hit that and we get a drop-down list. Okay. So all of these router protocols are in there. Now, we may have multiple protocols for the same manufacturer, but this list has grown since, I don't know, I started back in 2006. We had about a dozen routers that we controlled. Since then, you can see that the list has grown pretty big between Blackmagic, some old ones, Curtis Wright, Detrovision, Extron, even some competitive products. Geffen has 7 protocols, right? So, but you see here, Imagine Platinum. Now, some of the routers that are in Studio may not be in Christie Advanced, right? Because some of these have added after the fact, and I don't believe the ones that are in here that are not in there are even valid. So, but you'll see there's a whole list here. But there's also one for virtual. Oh, and also keep in mind that we also have right here a Christie Terra configuration, right? So our Terra product for switching 4K video in that ecosystem, now you can bring into Spyder as a router protocol. Okay, so if you want a large high-level switching from a Terra product, you can do that as well. I'm going to put in a virtual one since I'm working right now offline. You choose the connector type right here. I wouldn't choose audio. Best practices, if you know what connector type it is, pick the connector type. Okay, don't rely on anything that auto detects. Okay, I'll choose HDMI, and for this purpose, for our training purposes, I'm going to leave this at a 32 by 32. So that's 32 in, 32 out. Okay, I've got that in there. Now I could, if I wanted to, add a separate router, another router for, say, SDI, to feed all of the SDI connections on that Spyder inputs, right? Because we have 3 connectors on the back of that. So that could be a completely separate 32 by 32 that feed just all the SDI ports. Okay, so we'll just stick with an HDMI one for now. I'll go next, and I'll go ahead and just revamp my my config here and add that router in. Now we are planning to definitely have a whole topic on sources as well, how to bring in a source. But if you look over here, I have some sources already created. If I were just to tap on one of these real quick, just to give you an idea of how we assign a source to a physical, either to a physical input or to a router, this is how we do it. if I select on my existing source up here, you'll see I'll come over and you'll see right up here in the list, it says in1 and then RTR, meaning router, Spyder internal. That's basically saying that this particular source is going into physical input number 1 of the actual back panel of the Spyder. The Spyder internal is the internal cross point that it refers to. So the inputs on that cross point are the physical connectors in the back of the box. So when I look at that just at a glance, I know what physical input it's going into. So if I had to send someone back to troubleshoot something, they would know physical. I could tell them what physical input to look at. Now, if I go over here to the property panel, you'll see that I've got some basic information here for the source. I got the source name. I have a thumbnail image that I'm using, that I've imported, that I'm using. And then right when we get down here, we see router, okay? And there's the Spyder internal. Now, if I drop down the list, it shows HDMI router. Now, we haven't configured this router. There are several menus that you need to touch on before we start just throwing in a source, okay? But I wanted to give you a quick idea of how this is gonna go. So that once we've applied the configuration, we've included the router, the next step, if I go back to here, is to go to the property panel, right? The property panel is it repeats a lot of the information that was on that initial input on the new configuration manager, but it doesn't specify what serial port, if it's an RS-232 connection, or it doesn't specify, and it doesn't specify the IP address if it's a network controlled router. So we need to go to the property panel to configure that. So we would do that by going Tools, Routers, and then over here you'll see I have the option, the second place where I can add a new router. Say I just wanted to add it to this config instead of going through the new configuration process, I could do it right here. But I'll go right here to HDMI router, check it, and then come over and look at the property panel. So now I can see HDMI router, here's the protocols. If I pick the wrong protocol, I could drop down the list right here and change it, change the number of IOs, change the connector type. Now, because I chose a virtual one, it doesn't have any IP settings or serial settings. So let me just change this, and we'll just, since I've been using Lightware as the example, say I put in a Lightware IP. So when I do that, whoops, notice that it changes and it prompts me for the IP address. Okay. It also has an option here to change what port that's going to be controlled on. I'm sure I know there's someone in the audience that could tell me if there are other ports, but pretty much you shouldn't have to worry about any other of those settings. If I just say restore to default, that shouldn't have to change anything. But all of the protocols, even if I were to change it to a different manufacturer, all like the leech, right? So it has specific ports already dialed into it. If it's a multi-plane router, you can tell it what level and how many levels that it has, and what level you want to control. So it's a little, all that stuff's kind of baked into the protocol when we add it. So if I needed to put in the IP address here, I would say 192.168, maybe 0.150, right? And then I could come down here and query. Now I'm offline, so I can't really query that. But if I go back to my virtual one and I go to the query function, it basically sends a command and says, yep, I can communicate with that. I'm getting a response. Sounds good, right? Otherwise, you might get, if I were to change this back to something different, and I try to query, oh, wow, that's interesting. Maybe because I'm still offline, but either way. So you would go in here, and once you're querying fine, that's great. Not done yet, though, okay? So once we have that communication, now we want to go back to, whoa, I missed the slot here. Once we have that set up, now I need to go to something called the router patch. And this is where we define which outputs of that router are feeding which inputs of the Spyder, okay? Very important menu, okay, to reflect on here, because it really sets the logic internally on how a Spyder is meant to get a source from a router to a physical input, okay? So if, it says the router patch defines which specific output of the matrix router will be fed to the Spyder specific inputs. You can actually go in and disconnect specific outputs of the router so they don't see it, so it's impossible for them to actually be routed in. And then there's a function in there called unity, which basically just sets the out to in, and you don't have to really worry about that much. But here's how we get into that. So in the GUI, there's a panel down here called to the low, right below the command keys, and you'll see 3 tabs: System Patch, Alert Viewer, and then there's one here called Router Patch. I am going to expand this a little larger here, make it a little bigger, and quiet on the question front, which is nice. So now you can see right here, it says router. There's a drop down menu, and it shows you the Spyder internal router, right? This is not a place to tinker, okay? Everyone, do not tinker with the Spyder internal router. This is something that's predefined, and you just don't want to mess with that. So we're just going to drop this down, and we're going to choose our HDMI router, okay? Now, you can see there's a column here for physical output, connected to, and then connected input. So physical output refers to the outputs of the router. So this one had 32. So if I scroll down, you'll see that output 1 is connected to the Spyder internal router, and which physical input? Input 1. So since all of X80's inputs are universal in nature, it's a 1-to-1 configuration. It's 1 to input 1, output 1 to input 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3, 4 to 4, and so on and so forth. Scrolling down, and it will auto-populate however many inputs you have on your Spyder by default. So if it has, if I have a 32 output router and I only have a 24 input system, it's going to take the first 24 outputs of the router and automatically assume that you want to route all of those in. That's not always the case. You may not want to. Maybe you want to save some of your physical inputs on the Spyder to have stuff directly routed into it, so you don't have to worry about it being routable per se. So we give you some options here. So say on output 24, we wanted to have that option to say, we're not going to take anything in input 24 from the router. It's going to be a direct feed from something else. We can go right here to the connected to item, and I click on this, and you get a little drop down menu, right? And you can either say not connected, right here, or not connected, or there's another function there that hollers way back to the 2 and 300 series called direct to layer, right? And that was the term if you had patched a source directly to a physical input on the 300 series without a router, that we refer to that as direct to layer. But I could say don't connect output 24, right? And it'll take a second, and then it'll refresh, and you'll see right here output 24 is no longer being routed. Same thing as say you had a bad connection, a bad connector, or a bad output on the matrix router. You could redirect it, right? And say, don't use output 24, maybe use output 25, and click right here and say, all right, let's say take that to the Spyder internal, and then go right here and say route it to input, to input 24. Okay, so now anything that needed to come into Spyder input 24 would come out of output 25 of the router. Okay, so this whole menu here is how you set that logic, right? How does it know what output is going to which input? Okay, you can disconnect all, and it'll basically reshut and just reset all of those. Patch Unity does a 1-to-1, 2-to-2, 3-to-3. And then show properties, basically just if I had to click on something else here, if I say show properties, it just takes the property panel and brings up that router property panel, okay? So that's where we set that router logic, okay? Let me just toggle back here. The last item in the router, I'm gonna double back to this XY menu here in a second, but let's just revert back to the source subject that we were talking about a minute ago. So when we bring in our sources, let me just put in one right here. Let's say I'm going to add a new source. So I would come down here into the source panel, find it, just right click on any spot, and I can insert a new one. And this isn't going to be the source topic, right? Just going to very quickly show you how you would define that router. But if I come down here, add a new source, and then I come over to the property panel, and this is where I configure where to look for this source, right? This is one of the things with the source topic that we'll talk about. You got to tell it where to look, because then it's going to go sniff it out. So I would call this, let's say, graphics. Let's see here, GFX1. It asks for the input type. What physical type of connector is it going to be using? It's going to be using HDMI. come down here to the router, drop down the list, and I choose the HDMI router. And let's say that that source is coming in on input 29, right? So I would just simply say input 29. If it was 3D, we could put in some options here for active or passive. Down here, we'll see, is this a new configuration? Because we'll talk about, and again, when we talk just about sources, you can have multiple input configurations for a particular source. So this will be a new configuration. And then I would go down here to create and configure input. And when I do that, it'll go through this process real quick to go and sniff out output 29, route it to a physical input on the Spyder, and then auto sync. Okay. And then once that's done, again, we'll save this topic for sources later on. Once I get it in there, I can make adjustments and everything from here and hit save, and then come out of this mode. And now I have that source. And notice it says it's coming in 29 from HDMI router, meaning that physical router. So anytime I needed graphics 1, it would now simply, and here's the thing, if I'm not seeing, if I have 24 inputs, but I'm only using 8 or 9 sources at a time, Spyder only needs to route, it's not sending, well, by default it is. It's sending a command to the router, say, route this in, right? We have an option right under frame configuration called switch known crosspoints. If that's checked right there, that means every time I send a command to route a source, or every time I need a source from the router, it will send the crosspoint command, okay, to the router. If I uncheck that box, I launch a command key that routes that source into the system, and then I route another command key that has the same source needed for a look. It automatically knows that it's been routed in, right? So I don't need you to make that switch once it knows it's already been switched previously, okay? Let's see here. So that's one little buried little setting that you can keep in mind. And again, pause, rewind, and re-listen. One more thing about routers here is this router XY menu. Okay. So this allows you. I remember way back in the day we had an old ISIS router, right? That had that didn't have an XY front panel. It just had basically a power and then some other, just a couple of buttons. But it would be nice to be able to make crosspoint switches manually to that router, right? So if I were to double back here, under the view menu, you're going to see a bunch of panels, right? The ones with the check boxes here are currently visible in this GUI. The ones without are ones that are not commonly used and that aren't on by default. But one of them is called the router XY. And I'm going to go ahead and undock this and just move it up into our field of view here a little bit better. I'm not going to dock it to any particular panel. But here you can see yet another place to add a router, an external router. Over here, you can see there's a button to remove a router. Now, notice I'm currently looking at the Spyder internal. It's good that that is grayed out, right? We don't want to remove the internal crosspoint. So if I were to drop this down, choose the HDMI router, boom, here's the XY panel for that router that I've just imported or ingested. So the nice thing about this is that these are my inputs, right? Now keep in mind, 24 of those, 24 of the outputs here are feeding Spyder inputs. So I don't necessarily want to manually route, even though I could manually route a source in. If the resolutions are different, you would see some issues, and we'll talk about that when we get into sources. But if I say I've got a couple of outputs over here that you want to manually route for whatever reason, I could say take output 28 and route input 5, and it basically goes. So I can't control click multiple outputs and then pick an input and say take. It doesn't have that functionality, but it is a functional router. If you want to say I take 27, put input 17. If I go back to 28, remember, see, it still shows me the state of that, right, for each of these. One nice thing you can do for some troubleshooting purposes, this is the Spyder internal router, okay? So these inputs that you see right here are basically the physical connectors on the back of the box, right? So, and the outputs are layers, right? So outputs 1 through 24 are program layers, okay? 25 through 48 are preview layers. And then 49 through 96 are all internal use, right? That use for linear keying and then stereo applications and things like that. But if I just pull this down here, I'll show you how this might be helpful. If you're trying to see if maybe you're having a routing issue or something, it looks like I have a layer on the screen, or maybe not. If I take a source, input 3, drag it on to layer 1, and Blu-ray to 2, and dual 2 to 3, now I could come down here, look at input 1, and it shows me input 3. If I go up to verify that source right there, input 3, right? Output 3 would be layer 3, which would be this source. Go here, it's using input 14, right? So it's a quick way. If I wanted to switch that, I could basically just go in here and start routing. Now you're not going to see it in the simulator in offline mode, but you would actually see that hard switch on your outputs right there, right? But it's just kind of a neat way to be able to go and check to see if you're routing. One, if you're routing properly, right, through your external router, you could go in and see what was going on. But it's just a way to view that, right? I knew this wasn't going to be a super lengthy subject, and I don't see a ton of questions either, which I'm a little surprised at, but that's okay. Does anybody or do any of my panelists have any other topics with regards to routers, or maybe we can I can open up advanced real quick. Let me just open up that real fast and just show you what that would look like. So in advanced, it's literally the same process, okay? You either, whoops, of course it's the last one, there we go. So now, if I were to go file new and build my configuration here, let's just really quickly just put something in here and add my preview, next. And right here, it's the same thing. I can add a router, name it. Here's the list, right? You'll see it's slightly, it's only missing a few of the newest ones that we've added maybe in the last year. Analog versus DVI versus SDI, component, and S-video, those are all connectors that were available. Most of them aren't available. Well, there's no analog on the X80, but on the X20, you had the ability for analog. So we'll just choose DVI here. And then you could, again, add a SDI router because you had different connector types, right? Go next, and then I can apply that. Now, if I cancel this real quick, I can still go to the tools menu right here, routers, add a router. Call this, let's call it DVI. Again, 32 by 32, that's a big router for an X20, but okay. Virtual, and here's where you can say, where is it patching to, right? Theoretically, you could cascade routers one into another, right? Not recommended for many reasons, but it's theoretically it's possible within Spyder to do that if they're all controllable on the network. But you're basically saying what are the outputs feeding into, and that's where you're patching them to. Okay. The connector types. Notice it defaults to analog, and it says patch to X20 analog connectors, and you have the options for just BNC connections for component, for all those video SMPTE versions on the odd numbered inputs. I'll throw up a graphic in the recording so you can see that. Or DVI only and go just to the even numbered inputs, or you can actually choose both and it'll go to, it'll alternate between 1, 2, 3, 4 based on what you're trying to do. But if I were to choose DVI and then say okay, boom, it immediately prompts me over here in the property panel. And you can see, let me close this little help window here. Same items, what protocol, how many ins and outs, what connector, query, right? All the same things, same router patch down here. The only difference with this is remember that I chose DVI connectors for the X20. If I go down and look at this, notice that it was smart enough to go ahead and take the first 8 outputs of my of that router and feed them to X20 internal inputs 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so forth. Same with the SDI. Oh, I didn't add that SDI router, but either way, if it was SDI, it would go 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15. Same process though, right? You can disconnect ones right here, reconnect them in other ones if you need to, or shuffle that order if you needed to. Yes, Jason.
There's a question.
Sure.
What if a router output fails? How do we work around
that? What's your redundancy situation going on? Then that might be a question to pose to the group, and I'd be happy to maybe respond to that. Right now, you could, within X20, the function for sources, we're going to start getting into a topic that's for another webinar. That's kind of a source related question. In Studio, right, we have an option to define a backup source, okay? To say if this source fails, which maybe it fails because of the router output, right? We can assign a backup source and then go over here and right click and say use the backup source. And if I'm using that one on, let's see if I just put that up right here. I'm using that right now. If I were to say use backup, it's going to mix off and bring in my backup source, which is I've already defined as PVCS2B, right? And the nice thing about that is that if I use that source in any other command key, it knows that it's going to automatically replace it with the backup source. Okay, so I'm going a little off topic from the routing, but if a router failed, I mean, if a single output of a router fails, that's one thing. If the whole router fails, I'm going to lob that up to the group that does live events. What's your redundancy plan for that? Do you DA everything to a separate router and then just basically switch to a whole different group of sources that you're switching to? It's a good question, right? But I'm sure there's multiple ways to skin that cat. Joel.
Yeah, I think, and you did show it there when you built. So if you've got a bad patch from your router into the Spyder and you know where that patch is failure is, you can change it down here in your router patch to alleviate the problem.
Right here, yeah. So if you, like I said, if you had a bad output, say on 24, you could just go in here. This isn't something that's gonna, I don't have a hotkey that you can just hit and say, boom, go to that, other than the backup source in Studio. But otherwise, you could go right here, and as long as you have them physically routed for when you're setting up the system, then you could manually make that switch, and then it would go in, right? So that's what I would say would be the resolution for that.
And then talk again about the switch node cross points. I think that's an important feature, because I know in the X20 side, we used to toggle or unengage that box to get better performance in our router. And in X80, how does that respond?
Well, it responds the same way, right? So every time, I'll go back to that setting right here. And actually, if I let's open it up here, because the little comment section is live in here. So if I were to go right here, switch node cross points, and you'll see what it says. It says upstream router switcher performance can be increased by turning this option off, okay, which will cause the system not to switch a cross point believed to already be switched. Like I said, if I execute a command key that requires a source from the router, it's going to send a command to the router, route it into the system, and make it presentable on whatever layer I've chosen, all within, milliseconds, right? That's the whole idea, is that I can pick and choose what I want. If I hit the same command key again with the look already up, if that checkbox is checked, it's going to send the command again and route it in. If I hit it again, route it again, hit it again, route it again. If I check that box and turn it off, then I hit, the scenario starts, I trigger it once, boom, it makes the route. I hit the same command key again, it says, wait, I know that's already routed in, I don't need to send the command again. So it's just less traffic, I guess that's the best term, is that just less traffic to worry about, and which would inherently help router performance in that case. So I guess that's what I would That's what I would suggest, right? Any other questions? You can see the menus are very similar, and we'll talk about maybe we're spitballing different ideas for different webinars. So again, if anybody has suggestions for other webinar topics, by all means, please let me know, or any of us know. Yeah, Joel.
Talk about the router salvo, if you can, on the.
Okay. Yep. We'll dabble into this. It's another subject, but that's good. It's actually a pretty powerful subject, or a powerful tool. So we have something called function keys, right? And this is going to open up a can of worms, I know, because it's going to generate a lot of questions and a lot of interest. And a function key, again, going off topic, is a one-trick pony, right? It's something that's it's a single command that's meant to be very specific. And one of them is called a router salvo key, okay? I'm just gonna call this salvo. Now, before I get into that, remember my router patch. We have a bunch of outputs of the router feeding Spyder inputs, okay? But that means we also have a few of them that are not, okay? Spyder is already controlling this router via RS-232 or Ethernet. So what's to say we couldn't make cross-point switches to those outputs? Maybe they're directly feed. So put it in a scenario of downstage monitors, right? This is a way to manage downstage monitors. Maybe you didn't have enough outputs in your system to drive the DSMs or those monitors directly from Spyder. So you opted to put them directly on the outputs of the router. Now keep in mind, obviously the monitor has to support whatever resolution you're gonna try to bang into it, right? But if you have that big capability and all the sources are compatible, we have this function called a salvo that takes control of these unprocessed, or I think they're originally called unscaled auxes on the router side. But this salvo is designed to say, send a salvo for the HDMI router, and here are the outputs that are currently not patched to the Spyder that you could route to. And then there's another column right here to say input, I want input 28 to go to that one, input 15 to go to that one, and input 19 to go to that one. And when I hit the go button right here, boom, it makes those three cross points and sends those commands. So that's just one. Then maybe I do a different one that changes it slightly. I'll call this salvo 2. And instead of on this one doing input 28 to output 27, maybe we want it to be input 12. So now it would go this one with those three routes, this one with these three routes. So it's a very quick way just to simply take control of some an added function that we can take control of within the Spyder. And I'm pretty sure there's not that many people out there doing it. Okay, and ironically, the people who may be very familiar with some competitive products, this is an incredible feature. But guess what? It's been implemented since roughly 2005 in the first line of Spyder. So it's been out there forever, just like all program and everything else that a lot of these things that you're seeing. I hope that's helpful. I'm reading the question here. If you use a router before an X20, every time you change the source for a specific layer, you change the sources in the source monitor. Yes, this is correct. After a while, it becomes a mess. This is an inherent residual effect with using a router upstream, that if at one point you start routing, if most of your inputs are getting filled up from the router, at some point it may have to start shifting stuff around. So if a source might be on a specific area on one input at one look, you clear the wall and go to launch a different look that uses a different set of inputs, it may shuffle that around. There's no way to change that. If you think about it, there's inherently no way to make that consistent to make that work the way you want it. Now, if you want a source to always be in the same input, directly patch it, right? At least into the X80, right? or the X20, right? Either one of them, just direct patch, and that way you'll know that that particular source is always going to be in that position on the source monitor. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for that. But that's the way it is. Any other questions out there? No? Well, nothing there, Joel? Okay. Well, again, this one's a little bit shorter. Now you can go on to the next step. Like I said before we started this, I really appreciate everybody who's showing up to see these. I know you've got a lot of options out there because a lot of different manufacturers are doing a lot of webinar training right now. So we really appreciate you showing up for this. If you have any questions, you can email me directly. The next one we're going to be doing will be on Monday. As I go and look for my spreadsheet real quick, Monday is going to be the system patch and the property panel, right? Just a little preview. This is the system patch right down here, right? It's kind of a visual drawing of your layers, pixel spaces and outputs, and how the property patch plays into the entire GUI, okay? So again, thank you very much, people. I look forward to seeing you online somewhere, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Jason. And just like I say, keep looking for those videos in the YouTube page. They're going to be there. We should have 4 of them by the end of the day. Okay. Thanks again, guys.